All right. I figured that I would take some time and actually run through these game previews that I've posted the last few weeks for the playoffs. So I'll just start at the top and work my way down. So you can see on the left here, the Whitewater Mary Hardin-Baylor game, and then on the right, Mount Union and North Central. So pretty easy to explain the top. It's the spread and the total based on my main model. So that just takes the adjusted scoring offense, the adjusted scoring defense, and the adjusted home field advantage for each team and compares them, comes up with a spread and a total, right? So looking at Whitewater, Mary Hardin, Baylor, the model sees this as somewhere around like a 24-21 type game for Whitewater in favor, 27-24, whatever, pretty low scoring, close game. And then on the right, you look at Mount Union or Central, probably seeing this more as like a 42-35 type game in favor of North Central. So that's the top there, spread and total. Most people are pretty used to seeing those. So then we go down into the individual team profiles. So let's start over here looking at Whitewater, right? So there's 4 columns here. There's 2 columns of raw stats, 2 columns of adjusted stats. So the raw stats just mean I am taking those stats at face value. There's no attempt to adjust for opponent, no additional math other than just simple addition and subtraction, stuff like that, right? So you've got your rush percentage, total offensive plays, how many of them are run plays. You can see Whitewater and Mary Hardin-Baylor both lean a little heavy on the run. The national average is over 50% rush percentage, but still both of those teams in like the top third of rush percentage. I do not have an unadjusted home field advantage here. That is just because I wouldn't even know how to go about trying to compute that, right? So the adjusted home field advantage, that is the difference between how well a team plays at home versus the road, right? So it's not trying to see how much worse your opponents play specifically at your stadium. It is comparing how well you play at your stadium versus a generic away game, right? So both Whitewater and Mary Hardin-Baylor relatively close to average. The average is about 1.25 points per game. So that means home field advantage in general is worth about 2.5 points. Then if we look over on the other side, Mount Union, North Central, obviously a lot of chatter about home field advantage in that one. Mount Union really doesn't have a big difference between how well they play at home versus on the road. They're going to be about the same at home or away. But then on the flip side, North Central has a much higher home field advantage than normal, right? So we're getting to about the same value of home field advantage between the two here, just getting there by different ways, right? Mount Union with not very much, North Central with a lot, and then Mary Hardin-Baylor and Whitewater both around average. Then we go into scoring offense. Again, the raw stats, that's 42.7, that's how many points per game. Whitewater scoring, that's 15th in the country. And then we adjust for their quality of opponent. So that goes up to 49.4 points per game because they play a slightly tougher than average opponent. I shouldn't say slightly, much tougher than average opponent. Right. Then if we look at Mary Hardin-Baylor again, they're in the top 4 scoring offenses, unadjusted, raw stats. They have better than average opponent quality. So their points per game adjusted goes up, but the rank goes down because other people have more difficult opponent schedules. All right, so then we're start getting into some of the more, I guess you could say, advanced stats. They're really not that advanced. It's just stats that people aren't really accustomed to seeing much. So offensive series conversion rate, you can see that explained down at the bottom here, right? So it's the frequency the team either achieves a first down or touchdown for each new set of downs, right? So this is measuring, you get a first down, right? Either kickoff, punt return, whatever, you start a drive. How often do you move the chains? That's all that series conversion rate is measuring. How often do you move the chains? All right, so you can see Whitewater does pretty well, 81%. Mary Hardin-Baylor, 83%, 11th in the country, 24th in the country. We adjust for opponents, they both go up, right? So both in the top 12 in the country for their efficiency at moving the chains, right? So I kind of like to look at the series conversion rate as an efficiency metric. And then when we get down to the next one, rush offense, pass offense, total adjusted yards per play, that's more of an explosive metric, right? So as is the case for pretty much all of the offenses left in the tournament right now, they are both efficient and explosive in every single phase of the game, right? So they're all in the top 12 in efficiency and explosiveness, passing, running, whatever it is, right? So all of these teams are outstanding at offense. They're also all great at defense. They're just getting there in different ways defensively. All right, so staying with offense, so total adjusted yards per play, we're looking at rushing and passing, right? It's yards per play, but then you get a boost for first downs, you get a boost for touchdowns, and you get a big penalty for turning the ball over, right? So this is a metric developed by Brian Fry. He runs gridiron.com, and it's a little bit of a tweak to the traditional pro football reference adjusted net yards per play, right? So in rushing offense here and passing offense, I should also say I've moved sacks from rushing to passing. The NCAA counts sacks as a rushing statistic. I have moved them over into the passing offense, right? So sacks count as negative passing yards, and the denominator, the total number of plays, is your pass attempts plus the number of times you've been sacked. Then rushing offense, again, the sacks are taken out of that, right? So you can see all of these teams more efficient, or more explosive passing than they are rushing. That's pretty typical for most teams. Mary Hardin-Baylor, I mean, we saw the passing explosion against Linfield. I'd mentioned before that game that there is a little bit of a paradox where Linfield had the better overall offensive numbers, even though Mary Hardin-Baylor was more explosive passing and more explosive rushing. And that's just because Linfield had much higher percentage of their plays as passing plays. So Mary Hardin-Baylor, when they lean on that passing offense and how explosive it can be, they are dang good. You can see Whitewater not as explosive as these other teams, and I say that they're still the 11th most explosive rushing team and the 9th most explosive passing team in the country. So they are explosive, but compared to the other teams in the tournament, not as explosive. All right, going over to Mount Union and North Central here, you can see North Central in all of the adjusted, almost all of the raw stats, they are number 1 in the country, most efficient, best scoring offense, most explosive rushing, most explosive passing, right? Mount Union, similarly, and all the adjusted stats, they rank in the top 5, right? We know that matchup in 2019 was some great offenses just going at each other, and I'd expect something similar this year. Going into the scoring defense now, like I said, that's my main model. You can see Mount Union's unadjusted scoring defense, a little better than their adjusted scoring defense. Part of that is opponent adjustments, but part of that is also these adjusted stats are also adjusted for the order that things occur, right? So they've been giving up more points in the playoffs than we would have expected to from their preseason or pre-playoff numbers. So that's another reason why that's a little higher than you'd expect from their raw stats. Okay. Then going into some of the interesting stuff, the defensive series conversion rate. You can see, we've got the number 1 defense, number 2 defense overall, number 5 defense, number 12 defense. All the defenses are great, but you can see that some of the defensive series conversion rates are ranked not necessarily as high as what you'd expect for, say, the number 1 overall defense, right? So what this is kind of telling us is teams convert first downs a little more than you'd expect against Whitewater, Mary Hardin-Baylor, right? We kind of saw that both Whitewater and Mary Hardin-Baylor's games against Central and Linfield, right? They had success moving the ball, but they weren't getting big plays. You can see the explosiveness, right? Rush D, pass D, rush D, pass D. They were moving the ball, but they weren't finishing drives, getting it in the end zone, right? So for example, Mary Hardin-Baylor is second in the country in red zone defensive scoring rate. They have not allowed a red zone passing touchdown all year and only 2 red zone rushing touchdowns, right? So teams move the ball against them. They're only 25th in defensive efficiency, but they do not let teams score. Similarly, over here with Mount Union, red zone scoring rate, they're 19th in the country, right? So only 78th in efficiency, but by preventing the big plays, by preventing teams from scoring in the red zone, their scoring defense is better than you'd expect from the efficiency. On the flip side, though, you look at a team like North Central, right? So they are 5th in scoring D, 8th in defensive efficiency, but 77th in rush defense, right? They allow big plays in the running game more than you'd expect from a defense of that caliber, right? And they are 145th in the country in red zone defensive points per trip into the red zone, right? So they are less of the bend, don't break style defense that we're seeing from like Whitewater, Mary Hardin-Baylor, Mount Union, and more of a, we're going to put the pressure on you. We might allow a couple big plays here and there. It's usually not going to be through the air. It's probably going to be on the ground. But they are a different style of defense in the way they attack you from these other teams, right? So then we get into some of the special teams metrics that we have here. All right, so I'll focus on Mary Hardin-Baylor first, just because they've got some great punt teams and punt return teams. A lot of that has to do with their Gallardi Trophy semifinalists that they got back there for both of them, right? So I'm calling this the same metric, total adjusted yards per play, as I am for rushing and passing, right? So the calculations down here are explained. So good things that happen that aren't going to be tallied in your typical net yardage are going to be an addition. Bad things that happen are going to be a subtraction, right? So kickoffs, you've got your total yards for your kickoff. You've got a 6.7 yard boost on touchbacks, and then subtract return yardage and subtract 20 for return touchdown. So that 20 is first downs plus touchdowns, 9 plus 11, 20. All right, that's from, again, adjusted net yards. 20 yards is the typical boost for a touchdown. Okay, and then the 6.7 for each touchback, that comes from the average starting field position of a touchback versus the average starting field position of a returned kick, right? So a touchback for the kicking team is going to be 6.7 yards further back than a kick that's returned, right? So then kick returns, pretty simple. You've got your yards plus touchdown, 20 times touchdowns divided by the total number of returns. And then getting into punting and punt returns. So punting, you've got yards plus a 5 yard boost for punts down inside the 20. That's just a boost because, if you're downing the ball inside the 20, you probably could have kicked it further if it weren't for the goal line, right? And then -20 for the touchback, just going from, the net yardage of where the ball goes compared to the total yards that you kicked it, and then also return yards, return touchdowns. And just like a turnover in rushing and passing is worth 45 yards, turnover, a blocked punt is -45 yards. And that's divided by your total number of punts plus total number of blocked punts. Then punt returns, similar to kick returns, but we've got blocks added as well. So, for example, my alma mater, Wartburg, they had a great punt return team this year, and they had good return yardage averages, but they also blocked a handful of punts. So they were one of the top 5 in the country. Trying to think of who the number 1 team was, but they had returned a couple punts for touchdowns, but then also blocked 5 on the year, right? So it's how good your returns are, how good you block, and that's divided by the total number of opponent punts, not just the total number of punt returns, right? So, a gain, positive yardage on a punt return on any punt, so even a fair catch is included in your punt return team average. All right, so then if we start looking at how good each team is, right? Whitewater is pretty solid all across the board. Their kickoff team does an outstanding job pinning teams back, right? So after they score, they do a good job of forcing opponents to drive a full field, similar to Mary Hardin-Baylor, one of the best in the country on kickoff. Mount Union, again, one of the best in the country. North Central, not as great, but still solid, right? We're talking about a difference in 8 yards from Mount Union to North Central on average for each kick return. So all of the teams pretty solid there. Then if we look at kick returns, Mary Hardin-Baylor and North Central not as good on the kick return team as Mount Union or Whitewater. But again, none of these teams are super bad, right? Mount Union, 172nd in the country kick returns, but we know they've got some pretty athletic skill players that can bust one if they return it. Punt return teams, Mount Union, best in the country, or punt teams, Mount Union, best in the country on net yards, again with a boost on punts inside the 20 and a negative for touchbacks or blocks. All right, and then all the other teams pretty solid as well. North Central, one of the top teams punting in the country. And then punt return, total adjusted yards, Mount Union, second in the country. Whitewater in the top 25, Mount Union in the top 10, and North Central solid, but not elite. And again, that could just be a conservative philosophy, right? Fair catching a lot of punts, not going after a lot of blocks. But they're really only getting a net of 4.8 yards on each punt that their opponent does. So then we get into some of the fun, more mathy stuff on the field goal percentage and PAT percentage over expected. So PAT percentage over expected, that's an easy one to grasp because the ball's being kicked from the same spot every time, right? So I know Whitewater fan talked to me after I first posted field goal and PAT percentages and said, how is Whitewater positive on field goals? Their kicking team sucks, right? And that's skewed because most of the time you see the kicking team, you're seeing the PAT team out there, and they have not been great, right? They're right at the national average. North Central below the national average, right? So you see teams make about 91, 92% of their PATs in D3. All right, so you're just taking your actual PAT percentage and dividing it or subtracting from the national average. So Whitewater is right at the national average, Mary Hardin-Baylor and Mount Union making more PATs than you'd expect given national averages. All right, then you get into the field goal percentage over expected. And this is a depth adjusted stat. So what that means is, the NCAA reports field goals in 10-yard buckets, field goals under 20 yards. So if you're kicking from the 1 or the 2 yard line, and then field goals from 20 to 30 yards, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, 60 plus. There's only been 2 PATs attempted above 60 plus this year. One of them last week, actually. But my analysis on the field goal percentage over expected, it looks at every single kicker in the country, how good they are at each distance, finds the difference between how well they kick at each difference, weights that by the number of total kicks taken in the country, figures out how many kicks would an average kicker be expected to make from each distance, and then same thing as the PAT percentage, you subtract it, right? So field goal percentage over expected, Whitewater actually very, very good, right? One of the top teams in the country. They're making 19% more PATs than you'd expect. The other teams that we're seeing in the semifinals, much closer to average, right? North Central doesn't really need to rely on their kicking game a lot, but as we're getting into these semifinal games, that becomes extremely important, right? Because you're playing against teams where the margins are super slim. Now, my model still thinks North Central is a pretty heavy favorite here, but again, they don't want to have to rely on their kicking team to win a game for them. If you remember, one of the first times that North Central really broke through in the playoffs, the snow game at Mount Union, they ended up losing that game on a missed field goal. So not something that they want to rely on too much. Now, I will say, if we look at it by each distance, short kicks, North Central's making those pretty well. The medium distance kicks, so that's from the 30 to 40 yard range, Mount Union and North Central both not faring very well. But Mount Union does a really good job at like the medium short range kicks, the 20 to 30 yard kicks. And then Mary Hardin-Baylor, they're getting most of their value on the kicking game from the medium deep, the 20 to 30 yard range. They're hitting below expected on the shorter kicks, right? And a lot of this can be skewed because sample sizes are small, right? So Whitewater with 18 field goal attempts on the year, Mary Hardin-Baylor with 6, and then Mount Union and North Central each with 9. So that's what we're working with here on these matchup stats. So if you've got any questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. Thanks for listening.